So today we're going to begin female reproduction. As I mentioned last time, it's going to be a two-part lecture. So today we're going to talk about hormones, things like that. And then on Tuesday, we're going to talk about conception as well as the whole process of labor and delivery. So yeah, like I mentioned also the other day, that the female reproductive system is a little bit more involved than the male reproductive system. Us guys, nothing really to us. For you all, for most of you all in here, it's a little bit more complex. So it's going to be a little bit more interesting than male reproduction. Now, in general, so overview for female reproduction, the whole purpose of the reproductive system for women is going to be the production of gametes, right? So eggs, haploids, and then development of the embryo upon conception. And then it's going to be also important for the development and the nourishment of the newborn. So that's going to be a postpartum, lactation, things like that, breastfeeding, etc. We're not really going to go into lactation and breastfeeding for the purpose of this class. We already talked about it when we were talking about hormones earlier this semester. So we're just going to talk about the labor and delivery side. And then after that, we're not really going to continue beyond that. So here's a recap from last time, the difference between males and females in terms of the reproductive organs. So for males, testes; for females, ovaries. For men, the most important hormone is going to be testosterone, so androgens. And then androgens are also going to be important precursors for the development of estrogen as well. So we're going to talk about aromatase and how aromatase, the enzyme, helps to convert androgens into estrogen. And then the other one that's going to be important is progesterone. As the name implies, progestation. So progesterone is going to be really important in helping to maintain the endometrium as the fetus is developing in the womb. In terms of gametes, we talked about spermatozoas and we talked about the development of sperm. And then we're going to talk about the development of the oocyte. For men, we produce a lot of sperm every single day. For women, the majority of oocytes are going to be produced before birth. Then at the point of puberty, you're going to have about 400,000 oocytes. And then throughout reproductive years, so anywhere between like 13 years old up until the age of menopause, roughly 50 some years old, depending on the individual, you're going to have about 500 ovulations. So pretty stark difference between males and females in that regard. Now we're going to cover some of the basic anatomy for females. So here's one sagittal cross-section. I included this also in the male reproductive component too, so you've already seen this before. So let's look at some of the major components of the female anatomy. Everything that's going to be considered external genitalia is going to be referred to as the vulva. Then when you get into the labia minora, everything in between the labia minora is going to be referred to as the vestibule. Then above the vestibule is going to be the clitoris, and the clitoris is effectively the homologous structure to the male penis. Now, specifically, it's going to be homologous to the glands of the male penis. The thing about the big difference between the glands and the clitoris is that the clitoris has way more nerve endings than the glands for the male. So that's one of the major stark differences. Because of all those sensory nerve endings, it's mostly like a pleasure type function. Another thing to keep in mind here, speaking of the glands / clitoris, is the prepuce. Where did we see that last time? What's the prepuce? What's another term for that? Do you guys remember? Yes, the foreskin, exactly. So the hood of the clitoris is going to be referred to as the prepuce, very similar in its function and structure. And then the hymen. The hymen is basically going to be able to block any entrance into the vagina. And generally, it's going to be ruptured upon first intercourse. For some people, it might just rupture during menstruation when you're first like tampon use. That could also result in rupture of the hymen. And then this is what the hymen, there's variations in the hymen. For example, some people have porous hymens. Some have, it might be damaged due to whatever. So there's different variations in the hymen. Okay, so moving on, let's go into some of the other structures. Now, the ovary, that's going to be where you have production of your follicles as well as your oocytes. Then when you get into the fallopian tubes, that's going to be what connects the ovaries to the rest of the uterus. Generally speaking, during conception, this is where conception takes place. It's going to happen within the fallopian tubes when the sperm finally meets the egg. And then the uterus, that's just a Latin term for womb. And then the cervix is going to be the lower inferior portion of the uterus. And here's a couple images of different variations that you might see on the cervical os. Now, if a person is nulliparous, what does that mean? Do you guys know what that term means? Nulliparous means zero pregnancy. So this is a person who's never been pregnant, has never delivered a baby, or it could be a person who had been pregnant but had a C-section delivery. Okay? In other words, that means no baby has gone through the cervix. So it would look just, like a little dot. If a person is parous and they had delivered through natural means, right, instead of like going C-section, they delivered naturally, then you would be able to see what a parous cervix looks like. It kind of looks like a little slit. And then there's other variations of a normal cervix as well, all these different variations. You're not responsible for those, but just terminology when some of you might go into obs and gyn. So these are terms that you will be hearing, nulliparous versus parous, so that just means post-birth. And then a big thing to keep in mind about the cervical os is that it's going to stay closed while the fetus and the child is being developed within the womb. Now let's talk a little bit about what's going on at the level of the ovaries. So the ovaries is where you have oogenesis taking place. One question that I included here is, what's the male equivalent to oogenesis? What do we call that? Spermatogenesis. Good, exactly. So the development of the sperm, the gametes for men. Once the oocyte is released, then it's going to enter into the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube is also going to be referred to as the oviduct. And then eventually winding its way down into the level of the uterus. If the egg is indeed fertilized and is able to properly implant into the uterine wall, that's where it's going to take place. If the egg does not get fertilized, eventually it's just going to be released through menses. And here's an image of ovulation taking place. So here would be the egg, and here's the secondary oocyte bursting out of the egg. So pretty cool picture. So here are all the structures, the internal structures of the female reproductive system. So you have the uterus, you have the broad ligament, which allows for structural support of all the reproductive organs. Over here, at the level of the fallopian tube, at the connection point between the egg and the fallopian tube, you're going to find all these little fimbriae. The fimbriae are like these finger-like projections. So when during ovulation, the fimbriae are able to capture the egg so that the egg can be delivered further down the fallopian tube. And then throughout the fallopian tube, as I'm going to show you a little bit later, you're going to see a lot of cilia within the fallopian tube. And that cilia is going to help to move the egg further along the reproductive tract, all the way down to the level of the uterus. So let's talk about what the ovaries actually do. So within the ovaries, that's where you have the development of the oocyte, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here. You also have other cells within the ovaries that are going to be responsible for the production of both estrogen as well as progesterone. You're also going to see the secretion of inhibin. Okay, inhibin is going to help to inhibit FSH release. Now, which cell types did we already talk about that are going to be doing a similar thing in the male reproductive system? You guys remember? So what does FSH do in the male reproductive system? You guys remember? So you had luteinizing hormone, LH, and then you had follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. Luteinizing hormone acts on what cells? Do you guys remember? Leydig cells. Good. To produce what? Testosterone. What does FSH do? What cell type did it stimulate? Sertoli cells. Okay, good. And then Sertoli cells. What do the Sertoli cells do again? What's another term for them? Nursing cells. Good, nurse cells, and they help to allow for spermatogenesis to take place, right? So it's going to be kind of a similar thing going on over here. You're going to have, for male anatomy, when you have spermatogenesis taking place, you're developing enough sperm. At some point, you don't need to make any more, right? So you're going to have the release of inhibin to be able to reduce the amount of FSH being released from the pituitary. Same thing going on over here, or similar thing going on at least. You're having FSH creating a negative feedback onto the pituitary, or inhibin being a negative feedback to allow for FSH to be reduced. So kind of similar crossover, similar hormones, but just different functions. And then we're going to talk about the primordial follicles versus primary follicle versus secondary follicle in a little bit. And then eventually that secondary follicle is what actually gets released during ovulation. So this over here is going to be the secondary oocyte. So we're going to get into the follicles versus the oocytes in a moment. Now, oogenesis is going to be the term for the development of eggs, or the ovum. Now, before birth, you're going to have a lot of eggs being developed. So those are all going to be in the form of primary follicles. Now, at the level of puberty, or once you reach puberty, then the number is going to drop down significantly. It's going to go from 2 million all the way down to 400,000. And then the term that we use for that is going to be follicular atresia. And during follicular atresia, that's where you have kind of a pruning back of all the number of follicles. And then after puberty, then every single month, you're going to have the release of of a different number of eggs until you reach menopause. And at menopause, that's when everything basically ceases. And we're going to talk about the hormones that are going to be involved in menopause a little bit later. So we already covered that. Oogenesis is going to be taking place here at the level of the ovary. So here's an overview of what's going on with oogenesis and the development of follicles, as well as the development of primary and then secondary oocytes. So when you first start off with the oogonium, let me go ahead and get all the little red boxes here so we can see what to look at. So we start with the oogonium. So this is kind of similar to what we were seeing with the spermatogonium. Remember, the spermatogonium undergoes mitosis. The oogonium does the exact same thing. It's going to undergo mitotic division. All right. So when you have mitosis of the oogonium, eventually you get that primary oocyte. That primary oocyte, very similar to when you have spermatogenesis at the very beginning, that's going to be a diploid cell. It's going to have 46 chromosomes. Then when you enter into meiosis 1, the number is going to change from diploids. You're going to have a diploid, so 2n times 2, so you're going to have a total of 92 chromosomes. Eventually, when you have meiosis 1 being completed, you're going to have that cell splitting apart. One half of that cell is going to turn into the polar body. That polar body basically gets degenerated. You don't need that polar body anymore. The only thing you're going to have now is going to be that secondary oocyte. The secondary oocyte is what eventually gets released during the process of ovulation. Once that secondary oocyte gets released, and then meiosis 2 is able to complete, that's when you have the fully mature haploid, right? So now this is going to have 23 chromosomes. Okay, so it's going to go from 46 to 92, and then eventually back to 46 again during meiosis 1, and then once it finally splits at the end of meiosis 2, now you're going to have 23 chromosomes at the end. So that's going to be a haploid. That's going to be a haploid cell. So let's go over the whole process of oogenesis in more detail. So the oogonium 2n, that's going to be a diploid cell. So 46 chromosomes. You're going to have mitosis taking place. So you have the oogonium undergoing mitosis, turning into the primary oocyte. That's going to have 2n times 2. Okay, so it's going to be still considered a diploid. It's going to have 2 sets of sister chromatids. Oh yeah, sorry. It's going to remain in meiosis 1 until you have FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, developing the follicles and also developing the primary oocyte. And then once that primary oocyte gets exposed to FSH in higher quantities, then you're going to have meiosis 1 taking place. You're going to have that polar body now that's going to be discarded. You don't need that polar body after that cell splits in half. Then you're going to have the secondary oocyte. So that's going to be N times 2. Now, this is going to remain stuck in meiosis 2 until the point of fertilization. If this egg now meets a sperm, then it's going to undergo meiosis 2. And then from meiosis 2, that's when you have the fertilized ovum. But at each step over here, you're going to have those polar bodies are going to be removed, right? So remember with the development of spermatogenesis, remember you wind up with 4 haploid sperm cells at the end. With oogenesis, you have 4, but only 1 of those eggs are going to be viable. The rest, the other 3, are going to turn into polar bodies, and those are going to be discarded. Okay, that's why when you have meiosis taking place in female reproduction, you wind up with 1 egg, versus with male reproduction, you wind up with 4 gametes. Okay, so that's one of the major differences that takes place. So let's go over this again in another depiction. So you start off with your 46 chromosomes, right? So that's going to be considered diploid, right? It's a full set of 46 chromosomes. The oogonia undergoes mitosis, right? So mitosis, where you have basically doubling up of the contents, it splits apart. You have 2 equal cells as a consequence. Then you wind up with your primary oocyte, still 46 chromosomes. Then you undergo meiosis 1. When you undergo meiosis 1, then you're going to have that 23 sets of chromosomes, right? You're going to split that 46 chromosome into 2, right? So you're going to have 46 going down to 23, and then that becomes your secondary oocyte. Now look over here, you have your little polar body. Your polar body is going to be the part that gets discarded, right? You don't need to use that. That's not going to be important any longer. Eventually you wind up into meiosis 2. At meiosis 2, once you have fertilization, when you have the sperm meeting the egg, then you have meiosis 2 taking place. And then now you're able to undergo the development of the embryo at that point. So, let's talk about the monthly cycles and how these things change within every single month. So this is going to be taking place every month. This is going to be the process of oogenesis. This is going to happen anywhere between puberty or menarche all the way to menopause, roughly like 50-some years of age. There's going to be all these primary oocytes. They're going to be hanging out within the primordial follicle, as well as the primary follicle, as well as in the secondary follicle. And then when you have oogenesis taking place, when you have development of the egg, that's going to be carried forth by the presence of FSH. Follicle-stimulating hormone is what allows for these quote-unquote follicles to develop. And within the follicles, that's where you find the oocytes, both primary and then secondary oocytes. Once you have the tertiary follicle being fully matured, several different hormones are going to come into play, which allows for the egg to finally be released, right? That's one of the things that helps to spear this process is going to be luteinizing hormone. And then you have the release of that secondary oocyte. Now, what gets left behind is going to be this little corpus luteum, which in Latin translates to yellow body. Corpus, body, luteum means yellow. And then the corpus luteum, once you have fertilization of the egg and implantation into the endometrial wall, the corpus luteum is going to be responsible for releasing progesterone, right? So progesterone, progestation, right? So it allows for that embryo to become matured and develop within the womb. If no fertilization takes place, then the corpus luteum turns into the corpus albicans. Corpus albicans means white. So it turns into the white body and it eventually just degrades and degenerates. And then the ovulation, I already showed you that image earlier in one of those slides there, but this is what it looks like when you have the actual egg being released. So this is going to be the secondary oocyte being released from the egg. Within around the oocyte, you're going to have a bunch of follicular fluids. So kind of a cool process. So let's talk about follicles versus oocytes. You guys are going to have to be able to distinguish between the two, okay? So with the primary follicle with the primordial follicle, the primary follicle, and the secondary follicle, each of those follicles are going to contain the primary oocyte. Okay, so the primordial follicle contains a primary oocyte. Primary follicle, primary oocyte. Secondary follicle, primary oocyte. Once you get to the tertiary follicle, that's when you have a secondary oocyte. Now, the thing about the primary follicle is that you're going to have these cells being developed that are going to be responsible for secreting estrogen. The two cell types are going to be the thecal cells and then the granulosa cells. Thecal cells are going to release estrogen precursors. So they're going to be like androgens that eventually get aromatized through aromatase. They get converted into estrogens. That's going to take place within the granulosa. Don't worry, we're going to go over that in a little bit more detail later on. Once estrogen is being released more and more, that's going to help to further develop the egg, right? And then once you get into that primary oocyte stage, and then the once you get into the secondary oocyte stage, that's when it's getting ready for ovulation, getting ready to be released from the egg. Then at the point of ovulation over here, that's when you have basically all the cells that were involved in that tertiary follicle. Those are going to turn into the corpus luteum, and then after the corpus luteum is formed, that's when you have the release of progesterone. Progesterone is going to allow for gestation to take place. So here's your thecal cells, granulosa cells, both of which are going to be responsible for the production of estrogen. Estrogen is specifically going to be produced within the granulosa cells. That's where you have estrogen getting converted through aromatase, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So here's another image that helps to break down all these different steps. So at the level of the primary follicle, what type of oocytes do you have in there? Primary oocyte, good. So within the primary follicle, that's where you have the primary oocyte. Once you get into the primordial follicle. Once you get into the primary follicle, that's when you have those granulosa cells. Those granulosa cells allow the production of what hormone? Estrogen. Good. And so now that primary oocyte can start being being developed, matured. Eventually, now you have that secondary follicle. Within the secondary follicle, you still have a primary oocyte. It's not ready for release through ovulation. Then eventually you get to that tertiary follicle, and then the tertiary follicle is where you finally get to the point of having a secondary oocyte. And then eventually, with the increased levels of luteinizing hormone, once luteinizing hormone spikes, roughly around day 14 of the ovulation cycle, then you have that secondary follicle being released through ovulation. Sorry, did I say secondary follicle? I meant secondary oocyte. Once that secondary oocyte gets released, now it's getting ready for fertilization. All these other cells are going to eventually turn into that corpus luteum. And then within that corpus luteum, that's when you have the production of progesterone. And then, silly question, where does it take place? It's all taking place within the ovum. Or the ovary, rather. So here's another image of what that looks like, but corresponding now with those different hormones. Okay, so within the follicular phase, that's where you have the development of the follicles, right? So that's when you go from the primordial follicle to the primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle. Okay, so that's going to all take place within the follicular phase. That's going to be heavily determined by follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH. Roughly around day 14, that's when you have this spike of LH. It's an LH surge. Luteinizing hormone now allows for ovulation to take place. The egg now can finally burst out. It gets released into the fallopian tubes. What gets left behind is going to be the corpus luteum. LH and FSH now dip down. And then within the corpus luteum, now you see a rise in progesterone. Progesterone is going to basically be maintained throughout this whole entire period. And that's all going to be called the luteal phase, right? Luteal phase named after the corpus luteum. And then eventually, at the end of that, if no fertilization takes place, then the corpus luteum sadly turns into the corpus albicans, and then it just degenerates and dies. So these are going to be the different cells that are responsible for the production of estrogen. So you have your thecal cells, and then you have your granulosa cells. So your thecal cells are what have all those androgen precursors. Okay, the androgen precursors, those are going to be stimulated by LH, luteinizing hormone. Once those androgen precursors make their way to the granulosa cell, that's when you have the granulosa cell through the enzyme aromatase transforming androgen precursors into estrogen. So definitely make sure you know where estrogen is being converted. It's going to be within the granulosa cells. Now the corpus luteum, yellow body, that's why I highlighted here in yellow. That's what's going to be responsible for the release of progestins. Progesterone is going to be the most important one. And like I said, just think about progesterone as being pro-gestation, right? It's promoting gestation. It's allowing for the implantation of the embryo into the endometrial lining. It's preparing the endometrium to receive the embryo so that it can provide nutrients for the developing embryo. The corpus luteum, so I remember I mentioned 14 days, about 14 days, that's when you have that spike of LH, that's when you have ovulation taking place. Once the corpus luteum is formed, the corpus luteum is going to kind of linger around for about 12 days, depending on how long the person's cycle is, but on average about 12 days. And then eventually degenerating into the corpus albicans, where it just becomes degenerated and basically dies. Here's another image of what all that looks like. Cool. So here's a nice summary of all the different hormones that are going to be coming into play throughout the ovulation process. So you first start with the hypothalamus, which is going to be producing gonadotropin releasing hormone. Once GnRH reaches the anterior pituitary is going to be responsible for producing and releasing two major hormones, FSH as well as LH. FSH is going to allow for the development of those follicles. And then eventually that follicle gets released when you have the LH surge. Once the follicle gets released, the corpus luteum now is going to take over and producing progesterone. Estrogen, which is going to be coming from what cells again? Granulosa cells. Estrogen is going to be responsible for multiple different things. It's going to be responsible for secondary sex characteristics, right? So like breast development, things like that. Other things are going to happen too. You're going to have lower blood cholesterol as a consequence of estrogen. We're going to talk about why that's important later on when we get into menopause. So that's going to help lower blood cholesterol. It's also going to help to monitor the levels of these different hormones, including FSH, LH, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. Progesterone, as I mentioned, pro-gestation. It's going to help prepare the endometrium for implantation of the embryo. It's also going to allow for secretion of milk too. Another one that's going to be responsible for that is going to be prolactin. Right? Prolactin allows for lactation. Relaxin is going to be a really important one that helps prevent those smooth muscle contractions. Because if the embryo is going to embed within the endometrium, you're not going to want to have smooth muscle contractions. That's basically going to result in a miscarriage. So relaxin is going to help to relax, reduce contractions of the smooth muscles, and then inhibin. You don't want to have follicle-stimulating hormone being released during the luteal phase. So inhibin is going to be secreted by the corpus luteum to help prevent both follicle-stimulating hormone as well as luteinizing hormone. Once that luteal phase ends and now you get into the follicular phase again, then follicle-stimulating hormone comes back into play so that you can help develop and mature those follicles and the oocytes associated with those. Now, I mentioned already the cilia that's going to be involved in helping to move the egg along the fallopian tube. One of the major things that happens first, you have that fimbriae. The fimbriae help to like collect the egg. And then once it gets into the fallopian tube, then you have cilia that helps to kind of move the egg along. That's going to be coupled with peristaltic contractions. Peristalsis also is going to help to move the egg further along the reproductive tract. So that's what it looks like on an electron microscope. Pretty cool. And then within the fallopian tube, once the egg gets released during ovulation, it's going to take a few days for it to finally make its way down to the uterus. And then if the egg does indeed get fertilized, that's usually going to happen somewhere within the fallopian tube. I'm going to show you exactly where that happens, the ampullas, etc. But throughout the, when it's traveling through the fallopian tube, you're going to have the developing embryo now starting to reach different stages until it actually gets embedded within the endometrial lining. This whole process takes about 3 to 4 days, and let's watch a little video on what's going on here. It's a nice animation.
Ovulation is a part of the menstrual cycle when the ovum releases a ripe egg, or ovum. Inside the ovary are hundreds of thousands of follicles. Each follicle is a hollow ball of cells with an immature egg in the center. The typical 28-day menstrual cycle begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding. During the first 7 days of the cycle, a few follicles begin to grow at the same time. These maturing follicles secrete estrogen hormone into the bloodstream to prepare the lining of the uterus for pregnancy. Around day 7, all of the follicles stop growing and begin to degenerate, except for one. This dominant follicle continues to grow and nourishes the developing egg inside it. Around day 12, the follicle secretes a large amount of estrogen into the bloodstream. When the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, the anterior or front part of the pituitary gland releases a huge surge of luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. Around day 14, luteinizing hormone causes the follicle to undergo a sudden growth spurt. Right before ovulation, the egg detaches from the inside of the follicle. The bulging follicle releases chemicals, causing one of the two fallopian tubes to move in closer and surround the follicle. The follicle swells until it bursts open, ejecting the egg and fluid from the follicle into the abdominal cavity. In response, the fimbriae, tiny projections at the end of the fallopian tube, sweep across the ovulation site and pick up the egg. Microscopic cilia on the fimbriae's surface transport the egg to the entrance of the fallopian tube. Inside the walls of the fallopian tube, muscular contractions gently push the egg towards the uterus. After ovulation, the egg lives for 12 to 24 hours, so it must be fertilized by sperm from the male during this time for a woman to become pregnant. If it's not fertilized, the egg dissolves away and is shed along with the uterine lining during menstruation.
Very, very beautiful animation. Sometimes those videos can be really cheesy, but that one's particularly nice. So, as the video mentioned, as mentioned over here, you have to have contact with the sperm within 12 to 24 hours. Otherwise, you're not going to have fertilization taking place. The areas that you see fertilization taking place is going to be anywhere over here in the fallopian tube, especially in the ampulla and the isthmus of the fallopian tube. And then after fertilization, eventually with those ciliary contraction or ciliary movement, you're going to have that embryo implanting into the endometrial lining. So this is a hysterosalpingogram where they inject contrast so that you can actually visualize different regions within the reproductive organs. So pretty interesting. You can see where the fallopian tubes are located. You can see where the uterus is, kind of Y-shaped. Within the uterus, you're going to find a lot of different nutrients like lipids and glycogen. So those are all going to help to provide basically nutrients for the developing embryo. Now, if you don't have fertilization, that egg is basically just going to eventually degenerate. Eventually, it's going to be released during menses. So pretty straightforward stuff. So this is what the uterus looks like. If you did a hysteroscope or hysteroscopy, where they put a camera so they can actually visualize the inside of the uterine wall, this is what it's going to look like. Once the fertilized egg embeds within the uterine wall, and as it develops, The first 2 months or the first 8 weeks, that's going to be referred to as an embryo. After that, for the remaining 7 months of gestation, that's going to be referred to as a fetus. Okay. The main thing that the uterus does, it's going to provide protection, it's going to provide nutrients, and it's also going to allow for the removal of wastes as the fetus develops. Now let's talk about the uterine cycle, also referred to as the menstrual cycle. And it depends on person to person. On average, it's going to be 28 days, but some people have irregular menses, right? So that's not totally unusual to have irregular menses. There are, of course, certain conditions that can result in irregular menses. Rapid weight loss can result in amenorrhea, meaning zero menses whatsoever. Stress can also cause that too. I think I told you guys the story about like ballet dancers back in the day. Sometimes ballet teachers would say, if you're menstruating, that means you're not practicing enough. So stress, in other words, can be one thing that can interrupt this process. But generally, it's going to be anywhere between 21 to 35 days. And then estrogen is going to be implicated in this as well. When you have estrogen release, especially over here during the follicular phase, estrogen release is going to help to increase the amount of blood vessels. It's going to allow for the development of that endometrium so that you can have all these tissues here to allow for the implantation of the fertilized egg. Let me click a little video here too. Let's see.
This might seem hard to believe.
You know, that video is kind of long. Do you guys want to watch it or do you want to continue on? You want to watch it? Yeah? Okay, let's watch it. Cool.
But right now, 300 million women across the planet have a period. The monthly menstrual cycle that leads to a period is a reality most women on Earth will go through in their lives. But why is this cycle so universal? And what makes it a cycle in the first place? Periods last anywhere between 2 and 7 days, arising once within a 28-day rotation. That whole system occurs on repeat, happening approximately 450 times during a woman's life. Behind the scenes are a series of hormonal controls that fine-tune the body's internal workings to make menstruation start or stop during those 28 days. This inner machinery includes 2 ovaries stocked with thousands of tiny sacs called follicles that each contain 1 oocyte and unfertilized egg cell. At puberty, ovaries hold over 400,000 egg cells, but release only 1 each month, which results in pregnancy or a period. Here's how the cycle unfolds. Each month, beginning around puberty, the hormone-producing pituitary gland in the brain starts releasing 2 substances into the blood: follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. When they reach the ovaries, they encourage the internal egg cells to grow and mature. The follicles respond by pumping out estrogen. The egg cells grow and estrogen levels peak, inhibiting the production of FSH and telling the pituitary to pump out more LH. That causes only the most mature egg cell from one of the ovaries to burst out of the follicle and through the ovary wall. This is called ovulation, and it usually happens 10 to 16 days before the start of a period. The tiny oocyte moves along the fallopian tube. A pregnancy can only occur if the egg is fertilized by a sperm cell within the next 24 hours. Otherwise, the egg's escapade ends, and the window for pregnancy closes for that month. Meanwhile, the now empty follicle begins to release progesterone, another hormone that tells the womb's lining to fill up with blood and nutrients, in preparation for a fertilized egg that may embed with it. If it doesn't embed, 2 days later, the body's progesterone and estrogen levels plummet, meaning the womb stops padding out and starts to degenerate, eventually falling away. Blood and tissue leave the body, period. The womb can take up to a week to clear out its unused contents, after which the cycle begins anew. Soon afterwards, the ovaries begin to secrete estrogen, womb lining thickens, getting ready to accommodate a fertilized egg or be shed. Hormones continually control these activities by circulating in ideal amounts, delivered at just the right time. The cycle keeps on turning, transforming each day and each week, milestone along its course.
or a period. Although this cycle appears to move by clockwork, there is room for variation. Women and their bodies are unique. Menstrual cycles occur at different times in the month. Ovulation comes at various points in the cycle, and some periods last longer than others. Menstruation even begins and ends at different times in life for different women, too. In other words, variations between periods are normal. Appreciating these differences and learning about this monthly process can empower women, giving them the tools to understand and take charge of their own bodies. That way, they're able to factor this small cycle into a much larger cycle of life.
All right. You know what? I'm glad we watched that. That was a good one. So, I forgot to mention one thing. With this whole thing right here, it has to be fertilized within 12 to 24 hours of being released. How long is sperm viable? You guys know? Huh? You said something. You said 5 days? 3 days? Up to 5 days-ish. It depends, right? But sperm can be viable up to about like 5 days, and it varies, right? So in other words, if sperm enters into the reproductive tract before ovulation, right? Maybe it's like 4 days before ovulation. If that sperm is still lingering around within the reproductive tract at ovulation, then the egg can indeed get fertilized. So that's one thing to keep in mind for folks who are, either planning or not planning pregnancy. Okay, so we already watched that. Let's see, estrogen, progesterone. Okay, we already covered all that stuff. All right, so let's talk about the menstrual cycle and all the different phases that are involved. So make sure you know all the, I'm sorry. Yeah. Here. What's up? Sorry. Sync up. Oh, hormones are very powerful, right? So my wife has like 5 sisters. And so when they all live together, not only do they want to rip each other's heads off, but also like their periods would kind of coalesce, right? That has to do with the hormones. Like sometimes the hormones just kind of in the air, right? You've heard of pheromones, right? Pheromones are kind of, things that we can't see, we can't smell, but they're there, right? So that's how sometimes some people are attracted to each other. That's also how sometimes maybe some people are repulsed by other people. Could just be like those pheromones. It's kind of not fully well understood, but the theory is that it's the hormones that are just kind of like, influencing other people around them. So it's pretty amazing. Hormones are very powerful. It doesn't take much of a hormone to induce a pretty potent effect. So that's a really great question. So super cool. I think that's pretty fascinating stuff. In terms of the menstrual cycle, so you're going to have menses and the proliferative phase. That's all going to be within the follicular phase. And then in the luteal phase, that's where you have the secretory phase. Okay, so those terms are all going to kind of cross over. I'm going to show you a really good image that breaks down all those different phases so you can kind of follow along. Within the endometrium, there's going to be a couple different regions that are really important. One of the most important regions is going to be this guy right here, the functional zone. The functional zone is what grows and retracts every single month. Okay, the functional zone, if you don't have fertilization, is what eventually winds up in the menses. Okay, so the functional zone gets sloughed off. The other things that are really important are going to be some of these arteries, especially this guy right here. The spiral arteries, if you don't have fertilization, eventually constrict and then causes basically necrosis and death of that functional layer. So if you don't have fertilization, if you don't have the embryo implanting into the uterine wall, eventually the spiral arteries constrict, then you initiate the period. You initiate menses. The basilar zone, that's not going to change. It's going to kind of remain the same throughout. The only thing that's really going to change is the functional zone and beyond. Everything beyond the functional zone is what gets sloughed off every month during the period. And then in the uterine wall, as you have the functional zone proliferating, you have you're entering eventually into the secretory phase, then you're going to start getting a lot of secretions of different nutrients that would theoretically help to provide nutrients and support for the developing embryo. So glycogen is one thing. You also have a lot of mucus that's going to be released as well. And then eventually, if you don't have implantation or fertilization, that's when you have that functional zone eventually getting sloughed off within the period. So this is the chart. This chart is really awesome. It summarizes basically everything. It's kind of similar to the Wigger's diagram when we were talking about cardiovascular, right? So it kind of laid over everything so you can kind of see what an EKG looks like and what parts of the heart are contracting. This is a very similar type of thing. Up here you have all the different hormones that are associated with both the follicular and the luteal phase. Within the follicular phase, you have an increased amount of FSH, and then eventually you're going to have the FSH beginning to dip. But then, what was that? Once you get to about day, that was weird. Once you get to day 14, then you're going to see that LH spike. You're also going to see FSH spiking as well. Throughout this whole entire follicular phase process, you're going to have GnRH being released, okay? So gonadotropin releasing hormone is going to basically allow for this spike to take place eventually. Once that happens, you're going to have inhibin being released. That's going to inhibit GnRH, and that's when you're getting into that luteal phase over here. And the luteal phase is associated with the corpus luteum, right? The yellow body, which secretes and produces progesterone. What's up? Oh, gosh. Let me look into that, the exact mechanism of birth control. I was going to include that in our next lecture. I haven't gotten to it yet. So let me actually put that into my next lecture. I'll talk about OCs, over-the-counter contraceptive, or combined contraceptives, and I'll also talk about Plan B, okay? So apologies, I'll mention that next time, okay? So you have to be patient. Let me actually make a side note real quick here just so I know to remind myself to include that because I'm still working on our last lecture. So give me 2 seconds. I'm going to put that on my things to do here. Food, Plan B, and OCs. Cool. Any other questions? All right, so let's follow along some more here. So now you have, so that's going to be levels of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Down here, that's where you're at the level now of the actual ovaries themselves, right? So you have the different cells that are going to be responsible for the secretion of estrogens, granulosa cells, as well as progesterone, the corpus luteum, and then inhibin, which is going to inhibit the release of GnRH as well as FSH. So during this first section, within the follicular phase, you're going to have both menses and the proliferative phase taking place. During menses, you have sloughing off of that endometrial lining, right, the functional layer. Then eventually when the functional layer is all gone, then you have the proliferative phase, right? You're starting to develop those follicles, developing the oocytes, and you're also starting to slowly build up the endometrial layer again. Then eventually after ovulation, then you're going to have that corpus luteum, which is going to be secreting progestin, progestation. It's going to be maintaining the endometrial layer, right? So it's going to basically allow for preparation to receive that fertilized embryo. And down here at the bottom, it's kind of interesting. You'll see that you have temperature changes depending on what time of the month it is, right? So at the beginning, if you're at the secretory phase or the follicular phase, you're going to have a lower basal body temperature. Once you have ovulation, you're going to have an increase in basal temperature. So pretty interesting to see how all those different hormones have different effects depending on what time of the cycle. I did not include this in your guys' lecture notes, but I remember seeing this when I was in med school, and I thought it was freaking hilarious. I do dissections in the 415 lab, so we actually dissect sharks, and so shark brains look strikingly similar to the overall female reproductive tract, and I don't know, kind of funny. At least I thought it was funny. Or you guys are laughing at how not funny that was. Anyways, so menses, that's going to be day 0. As soon as menses start, that's going to be the beginning of the entire menstrual cycle, or the uterine cycle. That's where you have destruction of that functional zone, right? That's what gets sloughed off. That's going to be due to, remember, those spiral arteries. Those are going to constrict. It's basically going to prevent blood from reaching those tissues, and then those tissues are basically going to die off, and then they're going to slough off as a consequence. It's also going to increase the amount of blood that's being released too, and that's one of the reasons why when we talked about the hematocrit's going to vary from men to women because generally speaking, women, especially in reproductive age, menses, you're going to lose a little bit of blood, so women tend to run a little bit anemic when compared to men. But it's not really that much blood if you think about it. 35 to 50 milliliters of blood is a very small amount. It's not a terrible loss of blood, but, you know, it's a loss nonetheless. And then here's some terminology. So I mentioned amenorrhea. That means zero menses, right? That's a person that's not menstruating whatsoever. Many things can cause that. It could be stress, could be hormonal imbalances, things like that. If you have a really heavy period, lots of women get this. It's called menorrhagia. Okay, and then if you have a disproportionately painful period, that's going to be called dysmenorrhea. Generally speaking, it's normal for women to experience discomfort. I don't need to tell you guys. I know my wife complains about it. So, you can take drugs like paracetamol, acetaminophen, things like that when you're having your period. It can be kind of uncomfortable, but it's not the end of the world. If a person has discomfort to the point where it's debilitating, where it's actually interfering with their day-to-day activities, that's going to be falling within the category now of dysmenorrhea. That means it's a very painful menses. So in terms of the cells that are going to be involved here, you're going to have epithelial cells that are going to be involved in that whole entire proliferation. The epithelial cells are going to help to grow, to vascularize. You have all this vascularization taking place to allow to provide nutrients, things like that, all to the endometrial layer. And that all is going to allow for the development of that functional zone. Okay, so that's what's going on at the level of the epithelium. Okay, so one of the main things that's going on in terms of the proliferative phase, that's going to be involving rising levels of estrogen. Okay, and as you note over here, estrogen is going to peak at around the point of ovulation, along with luteinizing hormone. As luteinizing hormone peaks and then drops again, then you're going to see a drop in estrogen levels. That's going to be partly due to the fact that you're having inhibin being released. And then throughout that whole entire luteal phase, that's when you see progesterone levels peaking out. Already mentioned that. So the main arteries that we're concerned with are going to be the spiral arteries. The spiral arteries are what allow for proliferation of this layer. The spiral arteries, when they constrict, are also going to be responsible for the destruction of that layer, allowing for menses to take place. And then the spiral arteries are effectively coming off of all these other radial arteries that are found within the myometrium. The myometrium is going to be the muscular layer of the uterus. All right. Now, the secretory phase, that's going to be this section down here. It's going to correspond directly with the luteal phase. So just keep in mind, within the follicular phase, you have both menses and the proliferative phase. Within that luteal phase, you're going to have the secretory phase. That's what's going to overlap and correspond with each other. When you have this a secretory phase taking place, that's going to be post-ovulation. That's where you have the corpus luteum. That's going to be associated with the release of progesterone. It is going to peak about 12 days afterwards. It does last about 14 days, right? So 14 plus 14, 28. That's why on average, the full cycle takes about 28 days. And then as you get the development of that endometrial layer, that's when you have the production of both mucus as well as glycogen, which is going to help to provide nutrients for the fertilized egg. As you have that secretory phase continuing on, that's when you have the further growth and proliferation of those functional layers. And then that's going to be associated with the elongation of those vessels, neovascularization taking place, especially with those radial arteries and spiral arteries. And then that's when you also have the increase in your basal body temperature. So the temperature is going to increase a little bit throughout the entire luteal phase / secretory phase. As the egg does not get fertilized, the corpus luteum eventually is going to stop producing progesterone. Dang it. I was supposed to let you guys tell me that. But progesterone is going to be produced by the corpus luteum if the egg never got fertilized, and at the end of that cycle of the secretory phase, then you're going to see the corpus luteum eventually turning into the corpus albicans. And here's an image that just talks about the different temperature changes that you see, depending on whether or not you're in the follicular phase versus the luteal phase. Just know that in the luteal phase, you get progesterone. Follicular phase is going to be mostly associated with estrogen. And then you're going to see an increase in that basal temperature within the luteal phase. So now if you do get fertilization, okay, if the sperm does indeed meet the egg, then you're also going to see something called HCG, which is human chorionic gonadotropin hormone. This is going to be actually produced by the fertilized egg / zygote, right? So as the zygote, as the person gets pregnant, you're going to see increased levels in HCG. HCG is what you're testing for if you're trying to test it to see if you're pregnant. And depending on what stage of pregnancy you're at, you're going to have different levels of HCG. So for people who are trying to get pregnant, generally speaking, you're going to want to wait about 2 weeks or so to be able to detect levels of HCG in the urine. So it's going to be best around 4 weeks or so to check for HCG levels. That's when you're going to start to be able to detect them better. If you test a little bit earlier before that, generally speaking, those HCG tests are not going to be as sensitive, so they're not going to be able to detect whether or not the person's pregnant. Now, one interesting thing about the HCG levels is that it's going to help stimulate the corpus luteum. So it's going to stimulate the corpus luteum so that you also get more progesterone being produced and released. Progesterone, as I mentioned, that's going to be important for progestation. It allows for gestation to continue on. So HCG is basically going to help stimulate that corpus luteum to continue doing what it does best, releasing progesterone. Now, if you don't get any HCG produced, if you don't get fertilization, eventually the egg just basically gets released and lost and degenerated through menstruation. What's up? If someone was going through a miscarriage, yeah, the HCG levels would tank. So let's go back. So at the very bottom here, after several days after pregnancy, consider a miscarriage like a pregnancy gone wrong, right? You lost the fetus. Your HCG levels would just like very quickly degenerate, right? You would see a rapid reduction in HCG levels. All right, so unfertilized egg, it's just going to travel through the uterus. Eventually, it's going to be released in the blood through menstruation. So here is a decent summary of a lot of the different hormones that are going to be involved. We already covered several of these. We talked about gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. We talked about its effects on the anterior pituitary to help release FSH, to allow follicle development, oogenesis, as well as for the production of luteinizing hormone, which allows for the development of the corpus luteum, okay? There's also going to be some negative feedbacks taking place as well, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I highlighted one thing over here, effects on the central nervous system. Because estrogen is going to have effects on multiple different aspects of the person's body, right? It's going to be developing secondary sexual characteristics. It's also going to be affecting bone density, right? That's one of the reasons why if a person is postmenopausal, you guys are familiar with osteoporosis, right? Sometimes they'll have to go on Fosamax, those types of drugs that help to prevent osteoporosis. That's because estrogen is going to increase bone density. Once you lose estrogen through menopause, then you're going to have reduced bone density. But central nervous system effects are also kind of interesting too. It helps to increase blood flow within the brain. It's also estrogen also has anti-inflammatory properties. It's also neuroprotective. So estrogen is a really good thing, right? And we're going to talk about hormone replacement therapy and it's like positive and negatives a little bit later, if we get to it today. I hope we do. And then bone growth is going to be one of the other big things in estrogen production and release. I know this is a really scary chart, but if you understand all the concepts that we talked about already, this should basically be a supplement for all that information. So don't get too bogged down with all the details on that. Just have like the general understanding of what FSH, LH, and all that does throughout the process. But definitely know what's going on over here with the follicular versus the luteal phase, right? So you're going to have menstruation and secretion taking place over here, the follicular phase. So one thing to keep in mind about the hypothalamus and gonadotropin-releasing hormone, it's going to be kind of pulsatile in the way that it releases hormones. So it's going to change. There's going to be different pulse frequencies associated with different stages of the menstrual cycle. Now, if you have estrogen, that's going to help to increase the amount of pulsatile release of GnRH. Progesterone is actually going to decrease the amount of GnRH being released. So as you see over here, as estrogen levels increase, you're also seeing contemporaneously an increase in the GnRH levels. As estrogen goes down, you're going to see a decrease in GnRH. As you see progesterone going up, you're also seeing a decrease in GnRH as well. So those are all going to be affecting one another in terms of negative and positive feedback. Another thing that's kind of interesting too is that you're going to have in the anterior pituitary, you're going to have different frequencies of hormonal release. So you'll have frequencies that are going to be considered medium versus high versus low frequency. Now, if you had medium frequency release of GnRH, then that's going to result in FSH being released more. If you have really high GnRH frequency, you're going to see more LH being released, so luteinizing hormone. So kind of let's go back over here in terms of the levels of GnRH. As you see the GnRH spike going up, when it gets really, really high, that's going to affect LH. That's going to result in that LH spike. So you can kind of think of it in that way, if you kind of compare this to the graph that I had a couple slides back. Now, if you had really low frequency of GnRH, then you're going to see a little bit of release of these two hormones. It's going to be vastly decreased, but you're going to see a little bit of release still. LH is going to be released a little bit more than FSH. But know that when you have high pulsatile release of GnRH, that's what results in that LH spike, luteinizing hormone. Cool. So now during the follicular phase, where you're having the development of the follicles, it's going to be the first half, you're going to see FSH being released to allow for the development of those follicles. So also make sure that you know which follicles go where, right? You have the primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary, tertiary, and know which type of oocytes or correspond to each of those follicles. When you have increased levels of estrogen, you're also going to have increased levels of LH. So you're going to get that LH surge, and that's what allows for the ultimate ovulation at day 14 on average. All right. Moving forward. Then the luteal phase. Remember, luteal phase is going to be associated with the corpus luteum. You're going to have that LH spike that's going to induce ovulation. Now you're going to have the corpus luteum releasing progesterone. Progesterone is going to continually be released throughout the luteal phase. Eventually it starts dipping down as the corpus luteum degrades into the corpus albicans. That's when you see progesterone taking a dip. If you had an embryo that was fertilized, right, a fertilized embryo that's going to be secreting HCG, that's going to be kind of similar to the secretion of LH. Right? Because remember, LH is going to help also maintain the corpus luteum. It's going to help to release progesterone. HCG is going to do a very similar thing to help release progesterone from the corpus luteum to allow for the maintenance of the developing embryo. All right, so estrogen synthesis. So estrogen synthesis is going to be at the level of the granulosa cells, because remember the theca cells, that's where you have your androgen precursors. Androstenedione is going to be the major estrogen precursor. Once it gets exposed to aromatase, that's the enzyme that now converts androstenedione into estrogen. Now, know that androstenedione is just an intermediate. It's going to be the intermediate step right before you create estrogen at the level of the granulosa cell. There's going to be different estrogen molecules as well. There's going to be estrone, estriol, estradiol. Know that estradiol is going to be the most important of all of those. Estradiol is especially going to be increased if you have a person of increased age, a person who's overweight, because adipocytes are going to be increasing cholesterol levels, right? So if you have increased cholesterol, then you might also have increased production of these types of hormones, right? Because remember, cholesterol is going to be a precursor for these. If you have increased insulin production and especially alcohol consumption, that's going to affect the levels of estrogen in an individual, including in men. Now, if guys drink too much, and if they're obese and overweight and have too really poor diet, and if they're older, then eventually they can develop what we call gynecomastia. Gynecomastia can be caused by a lot of different conditions. It can be caused by alcoholism, which can also result in liver disease, right? You can also get it from different types of cancers, tumors. One that I put down the bottom that you guys are probably going to learn about when you get into pathology is Klinefelter's syndrome. That's going to be a genetic disorder where a person just is basically born with all sorts of different conditions, one of which involves gynecomastia. Some websites, including the one that I pulled this one off of, so this is on Johns Hopkins, it said that's not associated with cancer. That's debatable. Some resources do say if a guy has gynecomastia, he could be at a higher risk of developing breast cancer. Guys in general do have a risk of developing breast cancer. It's very minimal, but gynecomastia increases that risk a little bit higher. But it just depends on what resource you're looking at. Apparently, this resource from Johns Hopkins said no, but I've read other resources that said otherwise. One thing about estrogens is that they're going to be basically bound when they're coursing throughout the body. They're mostly going to be bound to albumin, which of course is produced by the liver. They can also be bound by gonadal-steroid binding globulin. And then there's other forms of estrogen. Just know that there's estrone, estriol, estradiol. Estradiol is by far the most important one. It has the most powerful effects of all the different forms of the estrogen hormones. And I want to do a couple quizzes questions before we dismiss. And I put together 10. I'm trying to see where we're at here. I want to actually do those before we dismiss. So we're here on slide 58. I have not too many more. Let's just soldier through these. If we don't finish all the slides today, we'll finish some of those next time. If we don't finish all the questions either, we'll finish those next time we meet. But maybe let's just soldier through and finish up. So estrogen, as I mentioned already, it's going to be responsible for secondary sex characteristics, right? So that's breast development, also hair distribution. It's going to be a little bit different than men. Very important for bone density. It's going to allow for osteoblasts. Remember, osteoclasts crush bone. That's one way to think about it. Osteoblasts build bone. So it's going to be important for that. Also important for central nervous activity, right? So I talked about increased circulation, blood circulation to the brain. It's also going to be really important in sex drive. So libido is going to be determined very heavily by the presence of estrogen. And then accessory glands are going to be important as well. And then maintaining the endometrium. Now, let's talk about what's going on with menses. So when a woman has their first period, we call that menarche. Okay, that's going to be the very first period that a woman has. Generally speaking, around like 11 to 12 years old. Some people might be a little bit earlier, right? Some people might be a little bit later. If it's earlier, we call that precocious period, right? I've heard of reports of some women, or girls rather, having their first period at ages as young as like 5 years old. I forget what the Guinness Book of World Records is for the youngest person that was ever pregnant. I'm pretty sure it was about 5 or 6 years old. If you guys want to look that up and confirm that. But there's some people that get really, really young, their first menarche. Then menopause is where you have a halting of all this. It's going to be approximately the age of 50. It just depends on person to person. And then when you have menopause, you're not producing estrogen. Because you don't have estrogen, what's going to happen as a result? You're going to have gonadotropin-releasing hormone, you're going to have luteinizing hormone, and follicle-stimulating hormone all spiking. They're going to go way up because they're trying really hard to allow the body to start producing estrogen again. But you're not able to produce estrogen, so those levels are going to remain really high. So here's the positive feedback loop and the negative feedback loop that can be associated with both estrogen and progesterone. This is not super high yield, so I'm going to skip through it. Now, if you don't have estrogen in your body and you're post-menopausal, that can result in a lot of different things. One thing that's going to happen is osteoporosis, which we just talked about. Another thing would be reduction or atrophy of different sexual organs. That could be the uterus, could be part of the breasts. You can also see thinning of the vaginal mucosa. Also dryness, that's another thing I didn't include on here. Postmenopausal women, they suffer from not only thinning of the vaginal mucosa, but also atrophy and dryness, right? They're not producing enough like mucosal secretions. And then also cardiovascular disease. Estrogen is actually cardioprotective. The moment a woman gets menopausal, her risks of getting a myocardial infarction goes really high. Now, younger women don't get heart attacks. Young guys sometimes do. But when a woman goes postmenopausal, sometimes that can result in increased cardiovascular risk. Pros and cons of hormonal replacement therapy. So obviously, pros, you're not going to get hot flashes. You're not going to get that bone loss. You're not going to get osteoporosis. But if you don't get, or if you do take hormonal replacement therapy in the form of estrogen, taking exogenous estrogen can indeed increase your risk of breast cancer as well as endometrial cancer too. So those are going to be some of the concerns. You can also get blood clots as a consequence. So let's very briefly talk about what's going on with the vagina. The vagina is going to be important in allowing for menstruation, right? So it's going to be passing all those menstrual fluids. It's going to be important for the purpose of intercourse and copulation. And it's also going to be really important as part of the birth canal, right, during labor and delivery. Here's what's going on at the level of the vagina. So you're going to have a couple different types of tissues. So you're going to have stratified squamous epithelium. It's not keratinized. Skin is going to be keratinized. It's also stratified squamous epithelium. It's going to be very similar to skin. It's very tough, right? But it's not going to have that keratinized layer. So you're going to still have similar cell types, but a little bit different. Other things that are going to be happening in the vagina, within the cervix, you're going to have different glands. Those glands are going to help to release secretions, right, for lubrication during coitus. You're also going to have water movement because it's permeable, right? So you can actually have water being absorbed within the vaginal wall. And then let's close on your microbiota. There's going to be lots of different bacteria, but the most important one is going to be lactobacillus. Lactobacillus, when we talked about probiotics before, when we were talking about GI, lactobacillus is something that you can actually buy at the store. That's a probiotic you can take. If you're taking antibiotics and you're getting dysbiosis, you can go to Sprouts or whatever and buy lactobacillus. You're also going to find lactobacillus within the vaginal mucosa. It's a very good bacteria. It helps to prevent other pathogens from taking over. If you do take antibiotics or if you have any sort of pH imbalance within the vagina, that's why it's not recommended to douche, because that can affect the pH balance. If you cause disruption in the pH balance and you wipe out the good bacteria, that can lead to dysbiosis. And the main one is going to be Candida albicans. Candida albicans is the main fungus that causes quote-unquote yeast infections. So if you hear the term yeast infections, that's Candida albicans. Where did we just see the term albicans? Corpus albicans, right? White. Candida albicans is white. That's why yeast infections look white. Actually, that's why they're named Candida albicans. It's white Candida from candidiasis. So Corpus albicans, Candida albicans. It's kind of interesting to see some crossing over in terminology. So, any questions before we start doing the quizzes? I know there's a lot of information to jam-pack into such a short period of time, but I think we'll have time to run through maybe about 3 of these questions. I'll start the class on Tuesday with the remaining questions. So I'll do this, just the first 3 today. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start it for the interest of time here. If you didn't log in, or if you couldn't log in, just give us your name. Okay, good. Excellent. Primordial follicle, primary oocyte. Secondary follicle, also primary oocyte. Make sure you know that. Tertiary follicle, secondary oocyte. Okay, so make sure you know what's going on there. Is there a tertiary oocyte? Nah. All right, let's do a couple more. Or maybe just one more, I don't know. All right. So let's see what you guys did here. Wow, that's quite a spread here. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of the ovarian follicle. Okay, so it's implied within the name. Stimulates the production of progesterone from the corpus luteum. No, that's not what's going on over there. So we'll talk about that maybe in a little bit more detail on Tuesday. We'll do the rest of the questions on Tuesday. But know what FSH does compared to what LH does. All right, so pretty important stuff. And then I'll see you guys also on Monday for the review session. So make sure you're prepared with questions and have a great weekend. Take care.